Good Shabbos. Here we go. Hi at home. Hopefully you can hear me. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם אותי לעולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם וביום השביעי שבת וינפש שבת וינפש ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן אמן לחיים. Okay, Torah Study blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'direi Torah. Amen. Okay, so let's begin. Whenever you're ready. No rush. Torah portion is another double portion. Every week I see people coming in this door and it's locked, and then they go to the other door. You know what I call it? L'dor v'dor. L'dor v'dor. I see it every week and I think it, but I never say it. All right. From one door to the other. Okay. Torah portion is called Acharei Mot Kadoshim, which is our second double portion in a row. Last week we had Tazria Mitzorah. This week Acharei Mot Kadoshim. And we're going to look at chapter 17 of Leviticus, beginning with verse 1. There's a lot going on here, and a lot of sources to pour through in order to understand this, but I think once we do, we'll find it hopefully pretty interesting. Before we begin, there's a tractate in the Talmud called Ketubot. You know what a ketubah is? A marriage contract, right? So it's interesting that the rabbis have 6 volumes, 6 different tractates about women, and none about men. It was like an elusive endeavor to try to understand women, and I don't know that they ever were able to. But one of them, it's called Nashim, which means women. One of them is Ketubot, which is about marriage contracts. And at the very end of Ketubot, long tractate, it's like 113 pages, which doesn't sound long if you're reading a book, but if you're reading the Talmud, that's interminable. I just started Kedushin. I finished Sanhedrin, now I started Kedushin, which is 83 pages, which is pretty long. And if you can read half a page a day, that's like an enormous amount of material. So it takes a long time. But Ketubot at the very end, like the last 3 or 4 pages, basically are about the love of the Jewish people for the land of Israel. And why would you have that at the end of Ketubot? Because there is a marriage between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. We're married to the land of Israel. That's the view of the rabbis, and that's why it's in the tractate of Ketubot. And there's some very powerful Zionist stuff at the end of Ketubot. But there's one line that, now this is going to sound annoying to us because we live in the diaspora. But before we read it, let me just tell you that Maimonides also wrote it and agreed with it, even though he lived in Egypt at the time that he wrote it, which is like the one place, the only place the Torah says you're not allowed to live is in Egypt. By the way, you can live there because the Egyptians of today are not the Egyptians of old. I don't know that they're any more hospitable, especially before 1979. But halachically, it is permissible to live there, especially if you need to. You know, like if you're an ambassador or if you have business there, you know, whatever. Halachically, it's permissible. Not too many. It's not a problem. Not too many Jews not too many of our members are coming to me and say, "Listen, I want to move to Egypt, but the Torah says I shouldn't. You know, what am I going to do?" You know, I don't have that problem that often. All right, but look what it says in the Talmud here. Let's see. Judy, would you mind kicking it off? So this is Ketubot 110b, where it says always, the first word. No rush.
Bavli Ketubot 110b. Always one should live in the land of Israel, even in a city which is mostly of idolaters, rather than live outside of the land of Israel, even in a city which is mostly of Jews. For anyone who lives in the land of Israel is as though he has a relationship with God, and anyone who lives outside of the land of Israel is as though he has no relationship with God. As it says, to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. And anyone who does not live in the land of Israel has no relationship with God. Rather, it is to teach anyone who lives outside of the land of Israel is as though he worships idols.
Okay, so before you go crazy, that's not what it means. Maimonides wrote the exact same thing in the Mishnah Torah while he was living in Egypt. And Maimonides did not believe that he himself was worshiping idols. Now, you could argue, well, he had nowhere else to go. I mean, he already fled from Spain because of anti-Semitism, and he actually did go to Israel, but there was no Jewish community there. He couldn't make a living, and then ended up in Egypt, where he became the doctor of the Sultan. He said, "I can make a living here, so I'm going to be here." So I'd like to try to figure out though what this means, because I'm telling you right now, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that you can't live anywhere else. In fact, the rabbis who were writing this stuff were in Babylonia. And, you know, if you're, you know, that would be me like writing a commentator saying, if you live in Pinecrest, you worship idols. It's not great job, security. You know, people are going to go crazy. So here they're writing for Jews who are in Babylonia saying, if you live here, it's like you're worshiping idols. It's not what they were saying. So what exactly are they saying? So the first thing that we're trying to show is, yes, we're here in Babylonia. I mean, you may not feel this today about Pinecrest, but they never knew how nice Pinecrest was going to be. I mean, they never knew. But they say, yes, we're here in Babylonia, but it's not our last stop. It's not where we want to be. And ultimately, there's another plan. Ultimately, we're gonna get to Israel and go back because that's where we'd rather be. But there's a reason why we'd rather be there, and those reasons are pretty deep. So the first thing that I'm saying is clearly there's something holier about the land of Israel than Babylonia or South Florida or wherever. But what is it? What is it for a Jew? And here's the other question. If you're not Jewish, is Israel the holier land than outside the land of Israel? Is there any sort of kedusha, holiness to the land if you're not Jewish? You ever thought about that? Now, today, the Christians and the Muslims would say yes. In fact, there's a war going on right now because of it. You know what Hamas calls the war that's going on right now? For the Jews, for Israel, it's called Charavot Barzel, swords of iron, which means nothing. It's a computer-generated name. Israel, they have their missions as a computer program, just spits out, okay? Yeah, .com. You can go to namesforwars.com, and if you want to declare war on your neighbors or something, as a joke. There's no. But tough crowd. But the name of the war for Hamas is the flood of El Aqsa. Not the flood of the Otef Aza. Not the flood of the southern Negev. The flood of El Aqsa. What's El Aqsa? The Temple Mount. That's what they were trying to conquer. That's the point of this war. We're still fighting over that area. The Christians, it's holy to them too because Jesus was there and Jesus taught there. And everyone agrees that the Temple Mount, there's something very special about it. So, unfortunately for us, the Quran alludes to the idea, doesn't mention Jerusalem, but alludes to the idea that Muhammad at the end of his life somehow flew east on Air Saudi Arabia and went to the Temple Mount, and from the rock that's under the dome of the rock, went up to heaven from there. But why? His life wasn't there, his career wasn't there. What does he need to be in Jerusalem for? Why did Jesus need to be? What is it? What is it about that land? So we'll take a look at it, but I just wanted to point out how strong the Talmud feels about it. Okay, so now with that introduction, which leads us to not really know anything except where we're going, chapter 17, verse 1 of Leviticus. Okay? Okay.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people, and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. If any man of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or sheep or goat in the camp, or does so outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the Lord's tabernacle, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood. That man shall be cut off from among his people."
Okay, so what just happened? Now, it's Leviticus, so we're talking about sacrifices. Now, does anyone know why Kohanim today, if you're a Kohen, you're not supposed to go into a cemetery unless it's a super close relative? Like for a funeral of a nuclear family relative?
Makes you tameh.
It makes you impure, and as a Kohen, you're not allowed to be impure. But impure for what? We don't have the Holy Temple anymore. Who cares if a Kohen becomes impure? So if a Kohen becomes impure, listen closely, and the Messiah comes back, and all the Kohanim are impure, no one will be able to go into the Holy Temple to do the sacrifices. That's the reason, to this day, that Kohanim don't go into cemeteries. Now, eventually, sometimes they have to, if it's a super close relative or whatever. But we need to have Kohanim who are going to be ready to do all of the things that need to be done in the Holy Temple. And if they're all of the impurity, the only way you can get rid of any impurity pretty much by going to the mikveh, with the exception of impurity of the dead, for which you need the ashes of a red heifer, slaughter the red heifer, burn the red heifer, mix it with water, and dump some of it over your head. But how are you going to be sure that there's going to be a red heifer? They only found about 7 red heifers ever in human history. So imagine if if the Messiah comes, the Holy Temple comes out of heaven and it's this beautiful thing, and we can't get in. Why? Because you went to your rabbi's funeral or, whatever. I told you not to go. Now we can't get in. Right? Okay, so that's the reason. Now, here we have a similar situation. Look what just happened. 3 things just happened in the verses that Ken read. One, we're offering sacrifices. The way in the wilderness that these Jews pretty much communicated everything with God was through sacrifice, and a lot of them were animal sacrifices. So, there are very specific rules about the animal sacrifices. And if you slaughter an animal, as you see in verse 3, any man from the house of Israel. By the way, what does that tell you? You don't have to be a priest to slaughter an animal. You were allowed, even in the times of the Holy Temple, anyone was allowed to slaughter their animal. But once you did, you had to give it to the priest. And there's all kinds of rules about this. Let's say you slaughter an animal, and you're schlepping it to the Holy Temple, and you're going to give it to the priest. The priest will then take it from you, and they'll do everything else that needs to be done. The draining of the blood, the salting, the burning, the throwing of the blood, the slicing, the dicing, the giving you your part, the giving everything else, they handle. But the one which is called shechita, people were allowed to shecht, right, slaughter their own animals. Now, let's say you said, this animal's holy. You have to consecrate it. This animal is holy. I'm going to offer it in the temple. And then you change your mind and say, oh, you know what? I thought I had another sheep at home, but I don't. And this is the only one we have to eat. You still have to offer it. And if you don't, that's a huge sin. Right? Because once it's considered dedicated, that's called hektish. And from the word kodesh, and you have to offer it. Now, let's say, okay, so the first thing is there's a Jew who slaughters an animal, an ox, a sheep, a goat, and he slaughters it outside the camp, okay, whatever that means. And he has not brought it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to bring before God. Okay, so for whatever reason, you've changed your mind. Or you just decide, this is, by the way, this was back then, you slaughtered your animal. Any animal back then had to be offered to God. Now, the priest would then slice and dice it and give you your meat to eat. Of course, they'd take a percentage for the priest. But they would give you your meat. Once the Holy Temple was built, anyone could slaughter any animal they wanted and then eat it. You didn't have to dedicate every animal to the Holy Temple. If you're living at the times of the Holy Temple in the Galilee, and it's time for dinner, you don't have to schlep down to Jerusalem to bring your animal. You can just slaughter it according to the kosher way and then eat it. No problem. But if you then say this is dedicated to the Holy Temple, then it has to be brought. In the times of the wilderness, though, there weren't that many animals, right? There weren't that many animals running around the wilderness. This is all they had is what they brought from Egypt, which was considerable, but after a while there probably weren't that many. They were much more valuable, though, because they had a finite amount of animals in the wilderness. So anyone had to be brought to the temple and be offered. So what we're saying here is, if you have an animal, this is big stuff. If you kill an animal for the purpose of eating it, and you don't bring it to the temple, you get kicked out of the Jewish people, and you lose your spot in heaven. How do I know that? Look at that's what it means, karet in Hebrew, but the end of verse 4. All right, so the end of verse 4 says, V'nichret ha'ish hahu mikerev amo. This person will be cut out from his people, which means you're gone. You're out of the Jewish people, and you lose your spot in heaven. So, I don't know if any of you ever saw, some people don't consider heaven, or sometimes they do. Larry David considers heaven. I don't know if you saw the one where he was going to get married to Cheryl, and it said, we're going to love each other for all eternity. And he said, well, wait a minute. I didn't know about that. I thought it was just this life. I don't know if I'm willing to make that commitment for, I commit to this life. But, in the future. I might want to keep my options open up there. So that may have been the best line in the whole series. Okay, so my point here in verse 4 is the consequences are dire if you don't do this the right way, if you don't bring your sacrifice to them. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 5.
Let's see. Verse 5. Oh, this is in order that the Israelites may bring the sacrifices which they have been making in the open, that they may bring them before the Lord to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to the Lord, that the priest may dash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord, and that they may offer their sacrifices no more to the goat demons after whom they stray. This shall be to them a law for all time throughout the ages.
Right, so one fear is that if you slaughter an animal, you'll bring an animal as an offering to a different god. Here it mentions the goat demons, the Seirim, whatever that was, probably something they learned in Egypt. But you could, so one fear is you would slaughter the animal to bring to a different god. The other option is, and these were actually considered like types of demons or some sort of black magic. I'm not sure where, I mean, they're actually mentioned in the book of Isaiah. If you look in Isaiah chapter 13, it talks about what these goat demons are. But if you're not offering these animals to God, then there's a real sin. Now, you know that once when Moses dies and Joshua leads the Jewish people into Israel, there's several hundreds of years, almost 500 years, before the Holy Temple is built. It's not till 960 that King Solomon becomes king. Right? David founds Jerusalem in 1000. He's king for 40 years. And then 40 years later, King Solomon becomes king. And in 960, they start the construction of the first synagogue, the first Beit HaMikdash, first Holy Temple. But, depending on how we date Moses, and it's different from different scholars, Moses is more around 1500. So by the time Joshua enters into the land of Israel, there's hundreds of years that go by while the Jews are in Israel and there's no Holy Temple. So what they did have, though, were what they called, listen closely, bamot. You ever heard this word? Bamot? If you speak Hebrew. What's a bama? In modern Hebrew, it's a stage. It's an altar. A type of altar. In modern Hebrew, if you go to Performing Arts Center, there's the bama, which is the same word as bima. Bima, bama, a raised area. But bamot in halachic literature refers to an altar. Now, they had in certain moments over those hundreds of years before they built the temple, certain times where they had permanent altars. Okay? Now, the Mishnah in a tractate called Zvachim tells you exactly where they were. And there were different kinds. The two main ones are in places you've probably heard the name, Shiloh and Gilgal. In Hebrew, Shiloh. Okay? So if you look at the third source, I brought some of it. Mishnah Zvachim is very interesting. Anyone know that word, zevach? Zvachim? Zevach means to slaughter. So there are two words for slaughter, zevach and shecht. Shecht means that you're slaughtering for the purpose of offering it as a sacrifice in the temple. Shecht, shchita. Zevach, and there's a whole tractate in the Talmud called Zvachim, means you're slaughtering the animal, but not for the purpose of offering it, just for the purpose of eating it, or using the animal for other things. Like you're going to make clothes out of the skin, or you're going to make a Torah scroll, or you're going to use the wool, whatever, but you're slaughtering the animal for other purposes, not for the purpose of being offered in the Holy Temple. That's Zvachim. Okay? And it is one of the hardest and most impossible tractates to follow. And unless you're a farmer and you really understand animals, or you have a good chart of the animal's body as you're doing it, you have almost no chance of understanding it. I once had a Chabad rabbi. I said to a Chabad rabbi, I have no use for this section of the Talmud. I'm never. Even if the temple comes back, and I'm allowed to shecht my own animal, I'm going to get someone else to. There's no way I'm doing this. And he said, so if you want to know how to answer a question according to the Hasidic way, you have to hold your hand here and look like you're in a great deal of pain. That's how they. So he. And then he says, that's the spirit of, okay, whatever. All right, but this part's actually pretty interesting. So, Genya, would you mind reading where it says, until the tabernacle was established?
Until the tabernacle was established, private altars were permitted and the sacrificial service was performed by the firstborn. And from the time that the tabernacle was established, private altars were prohibited and the sacrificial service was performed by the priests. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains surrounding the courtyard of the tabernacle in the wilderness, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten throughout the camp of Israel. When the Jewish people arrived in Gilgal, private altars were permitted. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten anywhere. When they arrived in Shiloh, private altars were prohibited, and there was no roof of wood or stone there, i.e., in the tabernacle of Shiloh.
Okay. Okay, now, what does all this mean? What this means is that there were different periods of sacrifices. The first period is before there was ever a tabernacle. I mean, sacrifices go all the way back. Noah offered sacrifices. Cain and Abel offered sacrifices. Everybody offered sacrifices. Okay, and in Abraham's time, offering sacrifices. Now, at that point, there's no tabernacle. The tabernacle is what Moses oversees in the wilderness. So before there's a tabernacle, you could do sacrifices anywhere you want. No problem. It was legal. You had to, do it according to the kosher way and stuff, but you could do it wherever you wanted. Once the tabernacle is built, then there are different types of offerings. Okay? So what we say here is, from the time the tabernacle was established, private altars were prohibited, and the sacrifices were performed by the priests. Which means for the period that they were wandering around in the wilderness, you could no longer offer a sacrifice in your backyard. You could before they built it, but once they built it, now you can't. You have to bring it over to the tabernacle. Why? Because all the Jews were together with the tabernacle. They were all in the same camp. Now, once they get to Israel, private sacrifices are now permitted again, sometimes, depending on what the central altar was. And there were 4 central altars. There was another one called Nov, and another one, Gideon, or something like that. But the 2 main ones were Shiloh and Gilgal. Now, there's a major difference here. When they were at Gilgal, private sacrifices were permitted, meaning if I want to give a sacrifice because my daughter's getting married and I'm excited, I can do it in my backyard. But on Passover, I can't do the Passover one in my backyard. That's one that has to be, that's an extra holy, and like the daily, morning sacrifice for all of the Jewish people. The main ones that were communal, and holidays had to be offered at the holy space. So during Gilgal, yes, private ones in my backyard, communal ones at the communal bama, the communal altar. That's Gilgal. Shiloh, the rule was different. Shiloh, nothing private, everything at the main altar. Why? Because Shiloh was a permanent structure that was there for over 300 years, and it had a whole wall around it, and it had a whole like it was more corporate. Like it was official, and that became the place. And everyone, if you, anything you had to, but Gilgal wasn't as official, wasn't there as long. It was more temporary, and the rabbis were more lenient. Or not the rabbis, but whoever the leaders were, the Kohanim, they were more lenient at that point. Okay, so I'm just pointing out that there was an evolution of how we got to where you could do sacrifices and where you couldn't. Once the Holy Temple is built in Jerusalem, then you can only offer sacrifices there, and that's forever. Which means to say that even if the Holy Temple gets destroyed, which it did twice, if you can't offer your sacrifices there, you can't offer it, period. Right. Clear so far? So it's a little tricky. So let me just sum all that up. There were different periods of time where you could do different things. But where we are right now, when there's a central tabernacle in the wilderness, it was forbidden to offer your sacrifice anywhere other than at that tabernacle. And as we just pointed out in verse 4, the punishment for doing so was karet, which is like a dire punishment, second only to capital punishment. Okay, and actually in some ways it's worse, because you can get capital punishment and still go to heaven. Karet, you're out. Okay. There's a comment in the Midrash, in a Midrash called Sifri, which is Midrashic material on the book of Deuteronomy. And it says this. This is second source on the sheet. Even though I'm exiling you from the land to live outside of the land, be marked in mitzvot, so that when you return to the land, they will not be new to you. Right. What does that mean? Yeah, it means, we don't really need to be here right now. You could have gone golfing. I mean, most of the congregation is. But, because they know this midrash. And they say, what a... So there's a comment from the rabbis that says, you might think that in the diaspora, and, you've been kicked out, you've been exiled, because you don't do the sacrifices anymore, you don't really have to do any mitzvahs. And the problem with that is someday you're going to come back. But if you come back and you've lost touch with the mitzvahs and you don't know what they are anymore, that's the end of Judaism. Because now you're back, but you don't know what to do. That's it. So why do we have services this morning? We have services this morning because prayer replaced sacrifices. Temporarily. The rabbi said you Jews need to pray 3 times a day so that you remember each one of these prayers represents one of the daily sacrifices that we used to do in the Holy Temple. And so when we get to Israel and someone says, Gesundheit, someone says it's time for Shachari, he said, no. Those days are over. Just bring me the lamb. Great. But at least we'll know. So, by the way, if you daven with an Orthodox prayer book, after you say the initial morning blessings, and you put on your tefillin and talis, you know what the next readings are that are not obligatory, but the next readings in the Bible? I'm sorry, in the prayer book? Korbanot. What are korbanot? Sacrifices. It's the various sections of the Torah that talk about the different sacrifices. That's the first thing you're supposed to read every morning. So when the Messiah comes, a learned Jew will say, of course I don't have to daven anymore. Now I can actually do what I've been reading all these times, because what it says in your prayer book is this is what you should be doing, but since you can't be doing it, now you got to do Baruch Hu and Ashrei. Clear so far? Okay, so that's the, yeah. No, but in this period, there were still prophets. And this is what the prophets were telling them. So it's actually in the Bible, because the prophets explained it. I should have mentioned that. The priests, you're right, the priests in and of itself have no no ability to construct halacha, but the prophets were there, which means that it came from God. So I should have mentioned that. Okay. Now, one of the things I've been trying to demonstrate is the holiness of place. Right? Heschel talked a lot about time and space, with time being more important. For Heschel, Shabbat was in and of itself the cathedral. Those are his words. Space was also important, but time was, and it makes sense, because there are proper times to offer the sacrifices too. If you offered your sacrifice at the wrong time, then it becomes pigul, which means that it's no good. Can't do it. Can't use it. You have to redo it, and then you have to offer a sacrifice for the one you messed up on. But time is also, place is also very important, especially once you're in that time. So, for example, now we're in Shabbat. Space becomes important. There are things you can't do from one domain to another. Right? Space all of a sudden takes on new sanctity. You know what an eruv is? You know, the thing like a fence that surrounds a city, which allows you to carry stuff from one domain to another. The eruv is only active on Shabbat and holidays. On a regular Tuesday that's not a holiday, you can carry anything you want anywhere you want. But on Shabbat, you can't. Okay, so there are two types of domains. What's called Reshut HaYachid and Reshut HaRabim. We're doing a lot of halakha today, but that's okay. A private domain and a public domain. You're not allowed to carry something from one domain to another, which means, you know, all of us in our homes, we have up to a point where it's no longer our home. You know, we get to the sidewalk or whatever. So if I'm carrying a book and I walk, I can carry it right up to my property line. But if I then step over my property line, I've broken Shabbat. Right? Now, what if my son lives next door to me, but I own the house? So there's two houses, there are two domains, they're both private, and I own them both. And there's a fence, and one side is my property, and the other side is also my property, but that's where they live, and I don't live there. I can walk through the fence with it because I'm going from private domain to private domain that are both under my ownership. So there's all kinds of rules. But look what this is how the Mishnah of Shabbat talks a lot about this. By the way, in Shabbat, so you might say this is stupid. Who cares? I'm Reformed. I can carry whatever I want. Okay, you could say that. But in the tractate of the Talmud of Shabbat, I think 6 of the 11 chapters have to do with moving things from one domain to another. It's very serious business. So if you look, and it's how it starts. So if you look at the very first Mishnah of Shabbat, look what it says here. If the pauper stands outside of the homeowner and the homeowner inside, right? So in other words, there's a poor guy and he's standing at the window. He's standing at the house, and there's a window, and there's a wealthier guy in his house, and I'm standing outside of his house in a public domain, and I reach my hand inside to his house. I'm now in a public domain, reaching my hand inside to a private domain. Does that make sense? Okay, so look what he does. He stands outside, the homeowner's inside. The pauper extends his hand inward and places in the hand of the homeowner, or takes an object from it and removes it. The pauper is liable and the homeowner is exempt. Because what did the pauper just do? Either he took something from the public domain and put it inside the private domain, which is a sin, and he's the one who caused that to happen. He's guilty. If the homeowner is just standing there like this holding a book, and the pauper then reaches in and takes the book, then the pauper is guilty also, because the homeowner didn't cause anything to move from one domain to another. Now, the next Mishnah is, what if he reaches his hand in and the homeowner puts it in his hand? And then he pulls it out? Okay, then they're both liable. Now, Question is, who cares? What's the difference? Everyone said that's my question. Okay, so what we're saying here is that space is important. Now, why do you think the Talmud uses a pauper and a rich man? I mean, obviously, it could be two rich men. It could be reversed. It could be a poor man's house. What do you think is being said here? Right, like remember we read in the Torah, if there's a judge and there's a poor person and a rich person, don't be sympathetic to the poor person and judge in the poor person's favor just because the person's poor. Judge based on the facts of the case. Right? And it's the same thing here. So the it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you can be guilty, and we don't give you sympathy because you're poor, and so forth. But there's a deeper point. Exactly, and vice versa, 100%. But there's a deeper meaning that I probably wouldn't have gotten. I heard this from, I think, Mordechai Tork-Ziner, who I quoted before in this class. He explained it this way. He said, where you come from, where you live, is part of your identity. It's part of who you are. You're from this town. You're from this state. You're from this country. You're from this socioeconomic class. You're from people who like the boat, people who hate the boat, people who like golf, people who hate golf, people who like the city, urban, whatever. You could tell a lot about a person's identity from where they live. Clear so far? I'm not saying much more than that or even what that means, but I'm just pointing that out so far. And this Mishnah alludes to that in a little bit. I mean, it gets more into the Gemara, explains more what that means, but there's an allusion to that. Now, what does all of this have to do with us? A more esoteric quote, this time from the Jerusalem Talmud, which I rarely ever bring in this class. But if you look at the second source on the back side of the sheet, Annabelle, would you mind reading that? Nazir 7:2.
God took a ladle full from the place of the altar and used it to create Adam Harishon, saying, would that he should be created from the place of the altar, such that he would endure. Thus it says, and Hashem Elohim formed the man, dirt from the Adamah, and it says, you shall build an altar of Adamah for me. The letter Adamah is the altar, so to here it is the altar.
Wow. Did you catch that? Really? No. No, okay, good. I was hoping for more no's. Okay, now there's a lot going on here. This is unbelievable stuff. When God went to Adam Harishon is Adam, the first Adam, the first person. It's also my middle name. So got that going for me. So when God went to create Adam, he took dirt. By the way, Rashi says this too. But he took dirt from the Temple Mount area. Adam means soil. You know, we tell kids, if you rub your hands really hard like this, and then you see dirt, it says, yeah, that's because we're all made from dirt. What it really means is that their hands are dirty and that there's dirt there. But it's a fun thing to do with kids. Because their hands usually are dirty, especially if they're little. So when God went to create Adam, and he made Adam out of the soil, he took some of the dirt right from the Temple Mount and used that to create Adam. Okay? So that's the first thing it says. He took a ladleful from the place of the altar, and we understand the place of the altar to be the place where where Abraham put Isaac, and that's where they inaugurated during the Akedah the altar in Jerusalem. And that's also many years before that, where God took Adam and created Adam. And he said, would that he should be created from the place of an altar, such that he should endure. And God formed the man dirt from the Adamah. Okay, so, and later on, the altar is going to be made out of dirt, right? We say we're not allowed to make it out of hewn stone and things like that. It's a good question. I'm not sure. It might have been. I honestly don't remember. It's a very interesting question. Yeah. Yeah. Very nice. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah.
That's the Dome of the Rock.
Yeah, that's where the Dome of the Rock is. But what we're talking about is the rock that's in the Dome of the Rock.
Where Muhammad.
Yeah, but it's also where the Holy Temple used to be. And, 1,400 years ago, the Muslims came. Well, the Garden of Eden was an expansive place that, went from river to river, right? The Genesis talks about the 6 different rivers that it expanded. But it would have this would have been the pinnacle, the epicenter of it, of the Garden of Eden, sure. So look how we started. We started by saying you can't live anywhere except Israel. And if you're not living in Israel, it's like you're worshiping idols. Remember that? That's how we started. Then we went to the Torah and we said, well, wait a minute. If you bring a sacrifice, it's got to go right to the tabernacle, which is a microcosm of the Holy Temple. So what God's saying is, while you're in the wilderness, I want you to get used to bringing the sacrifices to the tabernacle, or meaning to the primary altar. And once you get to the land of Israel, I understand we haven't quite built Jerusalem yet, so we're going to have to, sort of figure this out. But when we can have a permanent altar, we will, in Shiloh and Gilgal and so forth. But ultimately, we don't want them to be that great because they're not permanent. But eventually, there's going to be this guy named King David who's going to come and conquer Jerusalem, and his son will build us the final temple that we need, and that will be in the right place on the altar. All right. So what am I saying? 2 things. One is, God is getting us used to, already from the Torah portion that we're looking at, chapter 17, the first 10 verses or so, getting us used to bringing sacrifices in one spot and doing it all together. He's getting us used to it for the future. Kind of like we're getting used to now doing all the mitzvahs so that when the temple comes back, we'll be ready to do it. God's preparing them for what's going to happen. Start offering your sacrifices in one place. So imagine they're schlepping around the Sinai. And I didn't bring my sacrifice to some random place, wherever the tabernacle stopped, and we put the tabernacle, and I didn't bring my sacrifice here. I offered it over here, and they say, oh, you offered it here instead of there? You're cut off from the Jewish people forever. I said, why? You didn't bring it in the holy place. Well, what's so holy about this? We're in the middle of nowhere, guys. What's the difference? Over here is preparing us for the main altar, and over there, you're not doing it the right way. You're not getting prepared for what's going to happen when we get to Israel. That's the first thing that happens. Second thing is, we're defined by where we come from. Our identity, that's why we have all these laws of carrying and all this nonsense that we have to do. Because the domain that we come from is important. And we're defined by where we come from. And we come from Adam. And what does Adam come from? The Temple Mount. That's our natural home. So to live outside of the land of Israel for a Jew, to not recognize what our natural home is. By the way, the other nations could have had this as their national home too, but they rejected it because they weren't interested in it. Okay, fine. So you don't get the Torah. So we get the Torah. So we're the inheritors of it. But our natural home is the Temple Mount. And so if you're living outside of the Temple Mount, then, or if you're living outside the land of Israel and bringing your devotion to the Temple Mount, you're not home. And if you're not home, what does God say here? If you're offering your sacrifices, it's as if you're offering it to these demon goat gods. And it's the same thing he's saying to us. If you're living outside the land of Israel, I mean, that's what the Talmud's saying. We're not really offering it to demon goat gods, but it's like we are. Because we're not home, because we're defined by our home, and this isn't our home. No, so once the Holy Temple was built, no, you only had to go to the temple 3 times a year. 3 times a year, yeah. And you weren't allowed to charge rent if you lived there. You had to let people stay in your home for free. Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot, everyone had to go. But if you had a reason to go for another sacrifice, you could go whenever you wanted, but you didn't have to. And at that point, you were allowed to slaughter animals just for eating. And you were allowed to do that. You just couldn't dedicate it to the temple and then not bring it. Once you dedicated it, you have to bring it. But if you wanted to just slaughter it and eat it, as long as you did it the kosher way, it's no problem. Not in the wilderness. But once they got to Israel, you could do that. And people did that all the time. Okay, so running out of time, I just want to look at a couple more sources. If you look at what it says in 2 Chronicles, just to point out how special Jerusalem is for a Jew, if you needed any more proof, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place which David had designated, at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, which means that the home of the temple clearly is Jerusalem. Now, why do I need that verse to tell me that it's Jerusalem? Because the Torah doesn't say Jerusalem. The Torah doesn't mention Jerusalem. The Torah just says Asher Eretz Areka. God tells Abraham to go sacrifice Isaac in the place that I will show you. Now he tells him, it's the mountain, and he points him in the right direction. But how do we know for sure it's Jerusalem? Because of this verse in 2 Chronicles, famous verse, that actually mentions Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So how do you know the Mount Moriah that Abraham was going to was the one in Jerusalem? From this verse. Okay. Then 1 Kings. And when you hear the supplications that your servants and your people Israel offer towards this place, give heed in your heavenly abode, give heed and pardon, which means to say that when does God hear the Jewish people? When their devotion comes from the Temple Mount, right? From the place of the temple. Psalms very much says, 132, here I will dwell, for I have desired her, which means God lives in Jerusalem, in the Temple Mount, in where the Holy Temple was, and that God has a special relationship with the land of Israel, and that is the home of the Jewish people. Now, finally, that we've made that point, let me just show you one bit of halacha to help us make this make sense for our world. So, we can, walk out of here and say, that's great, I'm not making aliyah. If I hear a shofar for 3 days blaring, and then I know that the Messiah is coming, okay, I'll book a ticket with El Al, but, and I'll get ready to slice and dice if I'm a Kohen, but, what does this mean for us? Who cares? It used to be when you went on a cruise ship, now you go on, you don't have to go to your muster station. You can just watch the video in your room, which is so much, what an innovation. I didn't even want to go on a cruise because when you get on the cruise, you have to go to that meeting. And that meeting I was like, the only reason I'm on this cruise is so I don't have to go to meetings. But now you have to go to this meeting. And then you have to go outside and hear the horn blast. And they say, all right, we're going to demonstrate it to you. And they blast it. And so one time I was there alone on a trip with my congregation from Fort Myers, and they were all in really nice rooms, and I was, in the cheapest inside room that they give you for free if you're the rabbi. And so I'm in, with the luggage. So I'm with these people, and we're in a single file line outside listening to the horn, and we hear the horn, and they say, if you hear this, we're going down or something. And I said to the people next to me, either that or the Mashiach is here. And they didn't get it. They didn't get it. So all right. So look so my first point is this. Okay, so fine. we need to really spend a whole hour to tell us that Israel is the holy place. We know that. But there's one other point here. Beyond being together in Israel, which we can't do now because the Mashiach isn't here. The idea of Jews being together and these sacrifices that were offered outside of the camp are called shchutei chutz. Right? Shchutei from the word shecht, chutz, outside. Shchutei chutz is a sin. You can't do that away from the community. So beyond the place where we all come from, what's great about the place where we all come from is that's where our people are. And if you're away from that, that's a problem. So look what it says here in the Shulchan Aruch, the last source on the sheet. One should always endeavor to pray in the synagogue with the community. One who is forced, such that he cannot go to the synagogue, should specifically pray when the community prays. So if you can't make it to shul today, and you're at home, and you intend to daven at home, you should daven at 10:30. Why? Because that's when your community prays. If you go to a different shul down the road and they start at 9, be my guest. So they start at 9. But you should pray when your community, when your minyan prays, that's when you should pray. Now,
Their time zone and yours.
Wherever you are, the same time, but wherever the time zone is that you are. And one who is forced, such that he did not pray with the community and he prays alone, should still pray in the synagogue. So in other words, if I can't pray at the time that the community is praying, and I can't be here at the time the community is praying, but I can be here an hour later, I should come an hour later and go into the sanctuary and sit there by myself and daven. And the question is why? What's the difference? If I'm at home, I'm alone anyway. If I'm in the sanctuary here, I'm going to be sitting there by myself. Why can't I just do it in my backyard? And the answer is because the most important thing in Judaism is community. And what you're supposed to be reminded of is, yes, I'm doing it at 9:30 because this isn't ideal. If this was the ideal, I'd be at shul with the rest of my community. But since I can't, I'm going to do it at this time to remind me that I should be there. And if I can't be there, and I can't do it at that time, then I'm going to go there at after time, and I'm going to be here in the room where it happened, for the one that I missed, so that people understand. And everything that this is saying here is, if we don't stay together as a community, then God doesn't hear us. Then the devotion doesn't work. The sacrifices that are offered outside of the tabernacle aren't accepted. The prayers outside the land of Israel are accepted, but they're not ideal. It's almost like we're offering prayers to a demon god or God knows what. And so if we want to really, really be Jewish, so look what the penalty is if you don't do it. If you don't do it this way, you get kicked out of the community. And not only do you get kicked out of the community for not doing this, I mean, it's kind of a harsh penalty. Okay, so I brought my sacrifice outside away from the community. Now my punishment is I'm kicked out of the community, and that's forever. And so what we're saying is, yes, the reason you get that penalty and that you're separated from the community and that you don't go to heaven is because in this life, you separated yourself from the community. And that's like the worst thing you can do. So if you separate yourself from the community in this life, it's as if you're saying, I'm not part of this anyway. I have no use for heaven because I'm not part of this thing called Judaism anyway. And so this whole story about reasons why the sacrifices had to be inside the tabernacle or in the right place and at the right time, and if you don't do it that right, there's huge dire consequences, is because God wanted to tell us if we don't do it together, it's as if we're doing nothing. So, okay, Shabbat Shalom.